So President Trump now says that there is no nuclear threat from North Korea. Do you feel that way?
Fareed, obviously, that's a laughable statement, except that it's not funny because the situation is so serious. No, that is a blatantly false statement. And in fact, the threat from North Korea remains as clear and present today as it did a week ago. It's quite disturbing to me that the president would continue to repeat the mantra that the nuclear threat is eliminated when in fact we haven't even begun serious substantive negotiations. All he got out of the summit meeting, which was better than no summit meeting in the sense that now we are talking to one another and diplomacy has potential, was in fact a very, very vague commitment for that North Korea would take steps towards complete denuclearization, not even commit to complete denuclearization, which, as you know, is a far cry from even the commitments that have been made twice in the past. So we have a long way to go. A dialogue has begun, but the threat remains the same. And in fact, Fareed, in the event that this diplomacy were to break down and that two leaders with very vast egos find their hopes dashed, I think the potential for the risk of conflict goes up.
What would you say, though, to people like the president? I think one of his tweets and certainly his supporters that, look, nobody else was able to do this. I'm not quite sure what the do this is, but he did it, and he met with Kim Jong Un, and he's broken the ice, and he's gotten a process going, and you know the establishment doesn't get it.
Well, certainly it's the first head of state meeting between two sitting heads of state of North Korea and the United States, and that is in fact unprecedented. And if it leads to a verifiable, irreversible commitment to complete denuclearization that is then verified and validated as having been fully implemented, then Donald Trump truly will have done something that hasn't been done before. Thus far, what he has accomplished in substance, apart from the fact of the meeting, is a very vague statement that falls far short of previous commitments that North Korea has made. It makes no mention of verifiable denuclearization. It makes no mention of irreversible. And the reason why these words are important is because in the past, as you know, they have interpreted complete denuclearization to mean something very different than we mean it. So the fact is we have very vague commitments and no guarantee that they will lead to anything more substantive than in the past. But we have an opening, and we ought to pursue that opening. But now is the time for very concrete, rigorous diplomacy, led by experts that get into the very complicated details and figure out if, in fact, we have a substantive basis on which to make progress.
Do you think Kim Jong Un was the better deal maker, negotiator at this summit?
I'm afraid the answer to that is yes. Again, he committed to less than his father and grandfather. He got an equally broad security commitment from the United States, very vague. But what he really got was the opportunity for the first time to be on the international stage as an equal with the President of the United States and all the trappings and flags designed to make him look like an equal, something that his father and grandfather had sought for years to achieve and never did. And more seriously, what he got was the president's unilateral commitment to end what the president called war games with our South Korean allies on the peninsula. The fact remains that this was a bigger success by most objective measures for North Korea than it was for the United States. I recognize that you wouldn't see it that way if you were simply to listen to President Trump's spin on all of this. But in substance, I think that's a fair assessment.
President Trump says that your boss, Barack Obama, was going to go to war with North Korea. Do you have a sense as to what he's referring to?
I really don't. I don't know what he's referring to. I spent 8 years closely involved in the national security decision-making of the Obama administration. And while there were moments when North and South Korea came to heightened tensions, there was never a moment when the United States and North Korea were on the brink of war.
Ambassador Rice, stay with us. When we come back, we're going to talk about President Trump and trade wars. China said in an angry statement on Friday that the United States had regrettably launched a trade war against it. Is that good policy or bad policy? I'll ask Susan Rice when we come back. On Friday morning, the White House announced 25% tariffs on some $50 billion of Chinese products. The response from Beijing was fast and furious. The Commerce Ministry released a statement saying America had launched a trade war, that China would retaliate, and that all economic and trade agreements reached by previous negotiations will be nullified. Is this bluster or is it the start of a trade war? President Obama's national security advisor, Susan Rice, joins me again. So, Susan, what do you make of this? Is it 50 billion compared to U.S.-China trade is not that large a number? What is going on in your view?
I think this is the start of a tit-for-tat economic conflict that could escalate well beyond $50 billion on each side. What is unfortunate is the president gave up a very strong card he had in his hand with respect to ZTE and ZTE's theft of U.S. intellectual property and its violation of sanctions, and now got seemingly nothing in return for that concession, and in the imposition of now these new tariffs on the Chinese and the retaliation by the Chinese, we are walking down a potentially quite slippery slope. We have very legitimate reasons to be concerned about China's trade practices, its theft of intellectual property, among many other things. But the way to resolve this is not at the expense of American workers and manufacturers and farmers by getting into a trade war that has potential real global ramifications. At the same time as we are going down the same foolish path, much more foolish, with our closest allies in Europe, as well as with Canada and Mexico. It's very hard to see how we advance jobs and growth in the United States in the context of what has the potential to become a multi-front global trade war.
Again, what I think Trump would say is, look, nobody else was doing this. I'm looking out for American manufacturers. When their goods get to China, they have very large tariffs on them. I'm insisting that if that's the case, we're going to reciprocate. What's wrong with that thesis?
Well, it's factually dubious because, of course, depends on the products, depends on the nature of the sector and the industry, and there are many ways in which the United States and our workers benefit from trade with China, as well as have suffered some costs and consequences.
So when you watch President Trump, whether in North Korea, in Singapore with North Korea, whether with China, what is the style that emerges? I mean, you've sat in the Oval Office, watched presidents make decisions. What do you think is going on?
I think we have a leader in the president who plays his hand based on instinct, is more interested in form than substance, is really not interested in spending the time and effort to prepare and get into the details of an issue, even if he's in fact sitting across a table from an important adversary like North Korea or a very difficult competitor like China. And I think he's making decisions on the fly and by gut that don't take into account our historic relationships, our strategic interests, our values, and the implications of his actions for America's moral and strategic leadership. This past week was an extraordinary combination of contrasts. He goes to the G7, where our closest allies are assembled, and insults the host and disrespects each of our G7 partners, who are our closest democratic allies, with whom we have very important economic and strategic ties. And then he goes to Singapore and praises and embraces arguably the world's most vicious dictator and greatest human rights abuser, heaps praise on him, showers him with affection, and comes back and declares victory. So we are in a world, Fareed, where it seems that up is down and black is white, and we are seeing the whim of a president impact potentially and perhaps permanently America's leadership role in the world, our network of global alliances, which have kept us safe and strong. And we are on the brink, potentially, of very serious economic conflict, both with our allies and our major competitors.
Ambassador Rice, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
Good to be with you. Thank you, Fareed.